So to my slightly older disciples, I want you to think about something, if you would. What is the hardest or the greatest thing you have ever overcome in your life? And once you have that image in your mind, or you think about that thing, I want you to reflect on, how did you overcome that obstacle? So hopefully the answer for you is God, right? Because oftentimes life puts giants in our way. And sometimes these giants come in different shapes and different sizes. And sometimes they seem to be looming in the distance, and other times they seem very present and very real. And there are times that we question whether we'll actually be able to stand up under the threats and the pressure that this giant puts forward. So friends, we are going to continue on today, and we are going to work through the story of David and Goliath. It's found in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. So if you'd like to follow along, you can turn to page 278 in your Pew Bible, or again, it's 1 Samuel 17 if you're following in your own Bible this morning. So we are going to continue on as we look at what it takes to keep our eyes focused on God in the midst of these challenges. And we're going to continue to look at this idea of our series of how we can continue to develop into a people after God's own heart. So this morning I'm going to start by reading a small passage, and we're going to look at verses 4 through 10. And so the author tells us, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore a coat of scale mail armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all of the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So friends, why is it that you think the author of this book goes to such great depths to tell us what the giant looks like? Again, it's to make this guy larger than life, right? He's 10 feet tall. He's got 150 pounds of armor. The spear on his head weighs 19 pounds. And he's got a great big shield bearer that goes before him. And so the author's point here is to declare to us that this is no small threat. This is no mere mortal that has come into the presence, and it has not only the king, but also all of the army of Israel terrified by his words. Now, there's also another purpose here, because again, last week we talked about this conflict that is beginning to rise between Saul and David. And we talked about the fact that God had rejected Saul as king, and he has anointed David to fulfill, or to take his place and to fulfill the role of king at some point. And so what we see here is basically a breakdown of Saul's leadership, right? Because as king, what should Saul do in this situation? He should put a man to go out and fight, or he should go out and fight the giant himself. But instead, what does he do? He sits there and cowers before the challenge that is in front of him. And it shows and demonstrates a failure of leadership. Now, practically, what are some of the giants that we face in our lives? So metaphorically, we might say that there are giants that come up and challenge us in our marriage and begin to tear our families apart. Or maybe we've got a large amount of debt in our finances, and that giant stands there and it looks at us, and we question whether or how we're going to survive or how we're going to make payments on stuff that comes. What about addictions or failure? Or what about when the doctor calls and gives you that prognosis that you didn't want to hear? I'm sorry to tell you, but you've got cancer. And how do we feel in the midst of that? Oftentimes we feel just like Saul and the Israelites do, because again, the power of hearing those words and seeing that threat demoralize us, and we think, oh Lord, how in the world am I ever going to be able to get through this? I'm not strong enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not this. This giant is too big. But friends, our God is bigger. Even in my own life, as I'm sure all of you have at some point, I have faced giants. And again, there are times that I've looked at those giants, and when I've been focused on the giants, they seem so big and so powerful. And some of them seem a whole lot bigger than 10 feet tall. And I can feel about this big. And I can tell you that it's only been by the grace of God that I've had the courage to begin to go through and challenge those giants. And with the grace of God, I have succeeded. Now, I want us to look at the entrance of David into this situation. And there's a lot of verses here, so I'm just going to summarize this part. But what the scripture goes on to tell us is that David now comes on the scene, and he still is in this very servant and humble role. Okay, he basically is an errand boy back and forth between his father and his brothers who are on the front lines of this battle. Now again, many of us in our modern day context don't understand this, but think about what this must be for a young man who wants to be where the action is. And yet he's constantly left out. When his family has a sacrifice with Samuel, where is he? He's left to tend the sheep. Now the people of God go to war, and he's left to tend the sheep, and he's left to run messengers and products back and forth, resources back and forth to his brother, who get to be on the front line, who get to be where the action is. And so David begins to see this threat. He sees the giant come forth, and there's a beautiful verse where it says specifically that David hears what the giant says. And so last week we talked about this theme of being able to see other people and having the sight of God. And so not only does David see this threat, but he now also hears the threat against his people. And he hears the things that the giant is saying, but yet what is his response? Is it to focus on the giant, or is it to begin to move to solution, to begin to think of what God would call him to do? And as we go on, we find that that is indeed the latter choice, that again, almost immediately he begins to say, well, what can I do? Because what would the king offer someone who was willing to go out and fight this giant? Now again, maybe that sounds like a selfish desire, but think about this young boy, this young teenage boy who's willing to go out for battle against a hardened and trained soldier. Okay? And so we begin to see a comparison then of David and Saul, because Saul is sitting there in fear. He's not willing to take up the leadership command, and David now begins to move forward and look for solutions to the problem. So as some of you know, I've spent a lot of time reading different business books and different things, and it's always interesting when you come across what people think are bits of wisdom, and they put them out there like they're the gospel truth. And I remember reading a book, and it talked about how when you have problems, the thing that you should do is tape that problem right to your mirror in your bathroom. So every time you go in the bathroom, you can see that problem and know that it's there. And I remember sitting there thinking, you know what? That has got to be the stupidest bit of wisdom I have ever heard in my life. Because why would you, let's say you've got a debt problem, right? So you've got $1,000 credit card debt. Why every time that you have to go to the bathroom are you going to walk in there and have to sit there and think about the crushing weight of that debt on your life? Okay? And so friends, again, as we look to take on some of the giants in our lives, let us move towards the solutions, because when we begin to move from the problem to the solutions, when we begin to look beyond the giant, things become possible. And so what would it look like for that person that has that $1,000 debt, instead of putting the bank notice or the foreclosure notice or whatever they're getting on their mirror, what happens if they say, you know what, this week I'm going to raise, or I'm going to create an extra $100? Because all of a sudden, the solutions and the possibilities just became wide open, right? Because how many different ways are there to make $100? Quite a lot of them, right? And so now all of a sudden you begin to move past that giant and begin to actually solve and take on the problem rather than sit there thinking about it, which you're probably already doing anyway, right? Because that's the thing about giants. They're always there. We always see them. We always hear them. We don't need to be reminded every time we go to the bathroom. All right? Now, I'm going to ask you a quick question. So who is that? Anybody read the sign? All right. So again, I'm not here to be a proponent or an advocate for Jeff Bezos or Amazon, but I think they offer a very interesting story, again, sticking with our business theme of someone who overcame giants, right? And so if we think back to the founding of Amazon, Jeff Bezos started Amazon at a time when the internet was just really being discovered, right? And Bezos is a pretty smart guy, and he's a pretty gifted guy, so we have to give him that. Okay, it's not like he's just some ordinary guy that popped up out of nowhere and did this. But there was obviously giants that stood up for him. He was already very successful on Wall Street, and he could have easily stayed there and made a fortune. And yet he was willing to walk away from that success that he'd already had to go out and start a business out of his garage. And he walks away from Wall Street and all of the finances, and what's his main product? Books. Right? So you go from stocks and bonds to books, and not just generally not a lot of new ones, but a lot of used ones, right? And so think about this. So not only does he get denied by the company that he's senior vice president for him when he pitches this idea, but he has to go out, start this business from his garage. People are telling him there's no way this is ever going to work. You've got other corporations like Walmart that are devouring and grabbing up all this real estate, creating all of these superstores, saying, you know what, brick and mortar and these huge stores are the way of the future. In 1999, you have the dot-com bubble that bursts and tons of online businesses go out, and yet he sticks with it through it all. And he goes from working out in his garage and in a goofy office like this to now being worth, well, prior to his divorce, $170 billion. He created a company of almost $2 trillion in market cap. And again, I'm not here to advocate Amazon's business principles or anything like that. But again, just an idea of how this person took his skill set and went on to accomplish something, what I think is at least pretty amazing, and which has had an impact on each and every one of our lives, for good or for bad. So let's move in and let's talk a little bit about the preparation that David goes through, because it's very important to understand. Because so often in our lives, we take a look and we will look at someone like Bezos and go, well, yeah, it's pretty tough to do that when you got $170 billion. I mean, when money's not really an option, you can do a lot of things, right? But again, you have to remember where he started from. And again, he's a pretty smart guy, okay? He's not dumb. He was well educated and he had some good opportunities. But each and every one of us has been prepared along the way for the calling that God has given us on our lives. And it doesn't do us a lot of good to sit there and compare ourselves with other people. All right? And I have to say that I preach to myself on this, because there's a lot of times that I sit there and go, you know what, if I was just a better pastor, if I just knew a little bit more about the Bible, if I was just a little more outgoing, if I was just a little more social, if I was like this person or this person, maybe this would happen. And it's tough because, again, one of the giants I wrestle with is that I'm a person that's not overly specialized, right? In a world that demands and exalts specialization and the ability to create things in specific spheres, I'm generally a guy that has a general tool belt, right? I can maneuver along a lot of different things. So I'm kind of a jack of all trades, master of none, right? And there's not a lot of glory for people that have that skill set. And so I too have to wrestle with that giant a lot, because I can look at these people who I think are very successful and say, wow, I just don't really feel like I measure up. And yet that's not what God calls us to do. God calls us to remember who he has created us to be, and to say, you know what, you've had these sets of experiences. I've been equipping you all along the way to fulfill the calling I have on your life. So let's take a look at verses 32 through 40. And so anyway, David begins talking to people within the army, and he says, you know what, well, I'd be willing to take this guy on. And so they bring him before Saul, and they begin to have a conversation. And it's interesting here because, again, what's the first thing David does? He begins to encourage the king. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. And Saul replied, you are not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him, for you are only a boy, and he has been a fighting man from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, and I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over his tunic and tried walking around, because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in his pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in hand, he approached the Philistine. Now again, isn't it interesting that the very first words that David offers are words of encouragement? And immediately, what's Saul's response? Guess what, kid? You're not qualified. You're just a young pup. You're not a military person. You've got this 10-foot giant over there who's in the best armor we've ever seen, and you've got a staff. It's just not going to work. And friends, how many times in our lives have we heard people do that to us? That we believe God is calling us to go and do something, or we want to pursue an opportunity, and people think they know what's best for us, and they try to dissuade us from doing that. Now, friends, again, I'm not saying we shouldn't listen to the advice of people, but we do have to bear the discernment to see whether that is actually good advice or if it's poor advice. And this in the text, again, shows the decline of Saul's leadership. Because again, he himself is not willing to go out there. He now has someone that is willing to go out and fight for his kingdom, to fight for his people, and he immediately tries to dissuade him from doing that. But then again, David shows his courage because he says, you know what? Yes, I may not be donned in the best armor or have the best weapons, but here's what I have. I have courage and I have faith. Because when I was a shepherd, there was these threats that would come and they would try to take my father's sheep, and I would go after those sheep because I cared about them. And I was willing to put my life on the line to protect those sheep because that's what the Father had instructed me to do. And because I was obedient in doing that, therefore I saw success because I focused on God rather than the lion or the bear or whatever threat it is. And so, friends, I remind us today that that is what God calls us to do, that our focus needs to be on God, and that we shouldn't be embarrassed because of the past that we have. And some of us have broken pasts, but yet God can still redeem and use those pasts and equip us to do the work that He's called us to do. It's amazing to me how sometimes even in our brokenness, God uses that to actually define our calling. I know of people who have been abused in their lives and they think that they have to deal with all of this shame and all of this guilt. And as God goes through and redeems and heals that situation, all of a sudden they are able to minister to people and be an influence on people who have to deal with that very same stuff. And so, friends, even brokenness God can take and equip us to do important work. Now, the other part of this is that we need to choose our weapons wisely, right? The text tells us that David went out and selected 5 choice stones out of the creek for him to use, right? And friends, as we begin to take on the giants of our lives, so too we need to not just blindly rush out there and take them on, but we need to make sure that we're utilizing the weapons and the skills and the gifts that God has given us. All right? And so, men, I forgot to announce this to you last week, but one of the gifts that we have for you this week are some stones, so that you will remember how powerful you are. And when those giants come into your lives and they threaten your family or your community or your business life, we invite you to remember and reflect on these. And remember, too, that it is not just simply the rock that is the main emphasis, but it's the focus on God that helps you to wield this in a powerful manner. All right, so men, I want to just again encourage you and say thank you for the sacrifices that you have made, and just for you to again go out and walk in boldness and in faith and to protect your family and your community and to be leaders in those places. Now, I am going to add one caveat that I'm going to encourage you not to actually throw these at people or at things unless you are prepared for the consequences of that. But we have those for you, and I will pass those to you at the end of the service. So now let us just take a final couple of moments and let us look then at the results. Because again, we've gone through this whole story thus far. We might as well hear how it ends. And so I invite you to follow along with me from verses 41 to 50. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And this Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have defied. This is the day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give your carcass to the carcasses of the Philistine army, to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by the sword or the spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it, and he struck the Philistine on the forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down onto the ground. And so, friends, again, the beautiful thing about that story is that David does not go out there in his own strength. And yes, I have talked about skills and gifts, and those are important things. They're the tools that God has given us to do the work that he's equipped us to do. But again, our focus cannot be on those things. Our focus cannot be on ourselves and the things that we do, but rather on what God will do through us. And that is the beautiful point of that passage, and that is what allows David to go out and to defeat this giant that is threatening God's people. And so, friends, we will go this day and we will encounter giants in our own lives. We will come across people who are wrestling with their own giants. And what will we do? How will we support them? Will we be willing to have the faith and the courage to go to battle and to do the things that God calls us to do? Will we have the eyes to see? Will we have the ears to hear? So, my friends, bless you and keep you this week. So some action steps for you this week. Is there a giant threatening an area of your life? If there is, I encourage you to spend time with God praying and creating a plan to defeat it. Secondly, step deeply into the person God has created you to be. Keep your eyes on God, move forward with courage, and positively influence those around you. God bless. Friends, at this time, I would invite us to prepare for a time of prayer.